Good evening and welcome to Political Forum. This is a community service brought to you by CAN-TV. My name is Mike Jacobs and I'm a staff member here at CAN-TV, and joining us tonight is the Alderman from the 2nd Ward, Brian Hopkins. Nice to have you here, Alderman.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be here.
Excellent. So now for the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking about what's going on in your ward, what's going on in the city, and maybe like what's going on in the state and how those issues may be affecting your ward as well.
Okay.
So, but first, for folks who may not know, know you, because I know you're one of 13 new aldermen that joined us in the spring. Tell us a little something about yourself.
Yes, I am one of the 13 freshman class aldermen, but I came to the job with a considerable amount of experience. I'm very familiar with the building that I now work in, City Hall. The other half of the building serves Cook County government, and I worked for 20 years with Cook County government, most recently as Chief of Staff to Cook County Commissioner John Daly. So that gave me a good familiarity with local government in Chicago, with the issues in the neighborhoods as well. In addition to my work as a public servant, as an employee of the government, I also worked as a leader of the community organization in the neighborhood that I'm from, which is Streeterville. I was president of SOAR, which is the Streeterville Organization of Active Residents, that is now half within the 2nd Ward, the other half being within the 42nd Ward. So I had what I felt was a very strong resume that qualified me for the job. On the one hand, I had government experience, but then on the other hand, I also had neighborhood experience, and I thought that gave me a unique perspective on the issues that we face.
So let's show people your information, and we'll actually also show something about your ward. So your office is at 1400 North Ashland Avenue, phone number 312-643-2299, and folks can email you at ward02@cityofchicago.org. Now I'm going to flip this next overhead right here. This shows the ward. Can you explain the ward and the neighborhoods in it?
Well, no one can explain it really. When you put the graphic like that, it's not a shape that anyone could identify. And much has been made of it. It is gerrymandered. There's no question about that. I didn't draw it, but I represent it, and I'm very proud of that. You know, we talked a lot about that during the campaign, but what I found since I've been elected is you don't represent geography, you represent people. And I approach the job as someone who represents 50,000 residents of the city of Chicago. All 50 wards have approximately 50,000 residents, so we're fairly even in terms of population. And if you were to take a list of 50,000 people who happen to be 2nd Ward residents, I approach them one-on-one. You know, it doesn't matter to me if you're a block one way or a block another way. The type of service that you get, no matter what neighborhood you live in as part of the 2nd Ward, we're going to approach it in a uniform manner. So I found that it's actually easier to approach the job that way than we thought it would be. As a candidate, it's very difficult to represent geography like that because you've got to go from point A to point B, and it's constant travel. All of the candidates that ran for this office, myself included, spent a considerable amount of time knocking on doors. And when you have a map like that, it's hard to do. But when it comes to governing, you approach the job the same way no matter what neighborhood you're talking about.
And so what are there's several neighborhoods in the ward, correct?
Yes, we have on the east Streeterville, which, as I mentioned in the opening, that's the neighborhood that I live in. It's the neighborhood that I represented as a leader of the civic organization, which is why I put my office on the far west part of the ward, the Bucktown Wicker Park area. I wanted the office to be as far from the neighborhood that I live in as I could possibly get it. That was a campaign promise I made, just to show geographic balance, that there's no one part of the 2nd Ward that is neglected. In addition to that, the residents on the east side of the ward can access city services at City Hall. City Hall is relatively close and convenient for people who live in the eastern section of the ward. For the people who live in the western section, not so much. So I wanted the ward office to be there so everyone could have a chance to access city services without too much inconvenience.
And so what inspired you? We talked a little about your history, and background. What inspired you to run, for the 2nd Ward alderman?
Well, I've always been involved in public service. It's a passion of mine and has been since I was in grammar school. I was the kid who was running for student government back then. So it's really been a lifelong vocation for me. But getting back to the map, when that map was adopted, It was unforeseen. No one predicted that we would have a ward that looked like the second ward, and the people in the neighborhood that I live in, Streeterville, didn't predict that the neighborhood would be cut in half the way it was. So there was an objection to that, and frankly, I joined the objection. We didn't think it was a good move to split Streeterville in half like that. And there was a legal challenge to the map, but the legal challenge was not successful. So when the map was validated, the people that I'd been involved with encouraged me to run for the new ward seat that was going to be created as a result of that. So it was a combination of timing and preparation and being involved in a fight where we were trying to overturn a map that we didn't necessarily think was in the best interest of the community.
So now you've been, the alderman, for the last few months since the spring. What are people telling you? What are some things maybe that have surprised you, also during this time?
Well, one surprise initially was the sheer volume of service requests that came in from day one when we took office. We've had over 5,000 service requests that we fielded through phone calls, through email, through 311 calls, visits to the office. They come in a variety of ways. And we knew that there were things people wanted in the neighborhood. Everyone wants a safe neighborhood, everyone wants a smooth street, and they want the alleys to be paved, and they want flooding issues to be addressed. None of that was really a surprise because we know what's going on out there. What was a surprise was just the volume of requests that came in at one time. It turns out that people were waiting for the results of the election before they submitted their request. So we had a backlog of things that were out there waiting to be delivered, and when we opened our office for business, the phone started ringing off the hook on day one and really haven't slowed down since. So we're doing our best to get caught up, but there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. People have high expectations for what they want in their neighborhood. They pay high taxes, and they deserve to get a high level of service in return for that.
And so I'm going to show, because you're just talking about, you're getting all these requests, I'm going to show the overhead again, for folks who need to figure out, how they can get help is by calling your office at 312-643-2299, and also stop by your office at 1400 North Ashland Avenue. So do you have, are you looking then to branch out, and have ward nights, community nights, to help, figure out what your constituents need?
Well, every day is ward day, and every night is ward night in the office right now, especially in this day and age where electronic communication has never been more convenient. In the traditional model, you would go to the alderman's office maybe once a week, and you'd wait in a reception area for an hour and a half while your turn to have a 3-minute discussion would come up. That isn't really the most convenient way for people to make requests for the things they need. We are reaching out to the community every day. I'm out there 7 days a week, and as I said, we're fielding requests electronically. Most of our requests come in either by the phone or by email. It's much more convenient for people, and you're going to get the same results that way as you would having to wait for 2 hours to talk to either myself or one of my staff people in the office. But we are also operating a mobile office. We've been going around to neighborhood festivals, farmers markets. We're out there in the community. I would like to bring the ward office to the residents rather than make them come to my ward office. If you want to come to my ward office, you are more than welcome. It's there. We have free parking available, so we invite one and all to come. But if that isn't convenient for you, I'd prefer to come to the neighborhood anyway. I think that's what people expect today.
So you talked about bringing the ward office to the community and to the residents itself. Is this an issue when you're looking at your ward because it's so spread out? People feeling a disconnection. People on the west end of your ward with the east end of your ward. Is that something that you've heard? Any news so far?
Yes, people talk about the diversity of the second ward and how the neighborhoods don't really have a lot in common, and that's certainly true. But I don't feel like it's my role to force people to feel that they must connect to someone that lives 3 miles away that they don't know. That isn't really necessary. Each neighborhood has its own identity. People in Chicago identify with their community. Chicago is often called a city of neighborhoods, and that is certainly true. And I think that's one of the things that makes our city great. So I don't want to dilute that by coming along and saying, well, no, I'm going to force a new identity on you. You're not a resident of Wicker Park. You're a resident of the second ward. That doesn't make sense to me. What these communities do have in common now is that I represent them in the city council. And as I said earlier, it's a one-to-one relationship. And I treat every neighborhood equally. Each community in the second ward gets an equal amount of attention. There's no favoritism that's being played there. So the fact is that we're all bound by this, unique piece of map-making geography. But other than that, I don't see any reason to try and get people to step away from their neighborhood identity and identify themselves as a second ward resident instead.
Now you mentioned city council there. How do you balance the time between your commitments, to city council, legislatively, and then when you're talking about, commitments, inside of the ward?
It's a difficult balance to strike. Lately, I've been spending more of my time involved in some of the ward service issues. As I mentioned, we had that backlog that we inherited, a lot of things that need to be done and need attention paid to them. And that is really what people elected me to do. The policy end of the job is very important, and it's something that I happen to enjoy. But the adage is, when you're in city council, when you're in city hall, there's very few people there that can vote for you. The people who can vote for you are out in the neighborhood. So you can do a great job in city hall, and a handful of your colleagues are going to pat you on the back. But when it comes time to be reelected in 4 years, you go to the voters of the neighborhood, and they're not going to be terribly interested in how much your colleagues at City Hall like you. They're going to be interested in if you did the job in the neighborhood. Does the neighborhood look better than it did 4 years ago? Is there less graffiti? Have the trees been trimmed? Are the streets paved? That's how you're judged, and that's how your job performance is evaluated. So I'm acutely aware of that, and I try to spend as much of my time on the streets of the ward as I possibly can. We do have major challenges that face us as a city. There's policy issues that need to be decided, so I have a presence at City Hall too. But it is about striking a balance, and I would like to have a few more hours in the day, because when you get involved in a lengthy committee hearing and you've spent most of your day at City Hall, I really feel the need to get back out in the neighborhood, and I typically go to a community event during the evening hours.
So now let's talk about stuff that's going on in your ward, issues in your ward. I know that during your campaign you mentioned that crime is a main concern in your ward. So now that you've been in office for a few months, what have you seen, and what's being done about it?
Well, I've got a great relationship with the police commanders. We're in constant communication with them, as well as my staff. We work in close partnership with them. That's very important. You have to rely on the police. They're your eyes and ears on the street. People want to feel safe in their neighborhood. Very little is important as neighborhood safety. And we understand that. What's concerned me, as well as my 49 colleagues in the City Council this year, is the increase in the number of gunshot incidents. Recently there was a report that the number of gunshots fired on the expressway system in the city has doubled from a couple of years ago. That's a disturbing trend, because that means more people are driving around with firearms in their vehicles, and there's a debate on whether this is a result of the concealed carry laws or not. But the statistics don't lie. More people have more guns on our streets right now, and that doesn't make any of us feel safer. So we really have to get a handle on that. I have a lot of confidence in the Chicago Police Department. I've said consistently that we need more patrol officers. A number of my colleagues in City Council agree with that, and we're going to be talking about that in the coming weeks as we look at the city budget.
Oh yes, exactly. That's another thing. Talk about the city budget. I guess that have talks started, because I know that this has been in the news for a long time, because the city financially seems to be struggling.
It is. There's a way out of this mess, but it is a mess, and we have to be very careful about the decisions that we make now. What we're seeing is the results of decisions that were made in years past. The chickens have come home to roost, fiscally speaking. So I'm acutely aware of that. The decisions that we make today will have either positive or negative consequences years down the road. The budget process has just begun, and I think we're going to have a very robust debate. It's going to have to be a combination of revenue increases and spending reductions. There's no other way to do it. But we can argue, and we will argue, about what are the best revenue sources to use and what areas of the budget can we afford to cut. That's what the focus of the debate is going to be on. I think we had a preview of it just a couple of weeks ago. There was a debt reform package that the mayor's office introduced, where we had to refinance some current existing debt due to some interest rate swaps that were not favorable. There was one very positive element of that, and that was a campaign promise that I made as well, that we are going to eliminate the practice of scoop and toss, which basically mortgages our future at the expense of our grandchildren, and that is now being phased out over a 3 to 4 year period. So that's very beneficial as well, and that's the kind of mindset that we need to adopt. There's going to be some short-term pain for some long-term gain. That's really the only way to approach it. We're in a mess right now because we've approached it from the opposite standpoint. We've looked for short-term benefits at the expense of the future, and that's how we wound up where we are today.
So you mentioned new revenue, trying to generate revenue in the city. Does that include, I know there's been talk, especially downstate as well, with a casino coming to Chicago. Also, is there an opportunity maybe to look at the city government itself and see if there's any way to try and restrict some of the jobs? I'm not sure. I know that some people are saying there's some fat that could be trimmed there. What do you think is some ways to help bring some revenue to the city?
Well, one thing I liked about this budget process was the mayor was very clear at the beginning. He said each alderman is expected to bring some ideas to the table. So don't just show up and complain about how bad things are, and don't just shoot down every proposal that gets put in front of you. You've got to come up with some ideas of your own as well. And I think that's very healthy. There's 50 aldermen, so we could theoretically come up with 50 new ideas. I've come up with one already that I've been talking about. I've had a couple of meetings to develop. It's a savings that would result in reforming the way we do our data processing. We're very reliant on a mainframe computer system right now. It's older technology, it's a legacy system, it's extremely expensive to maintain, and it's not very efficient. Most other major enterprises in the country, in the private sector, have migrated away from that type of mainframe system. And I'm looking at the cost savings for that. It could be up to $10 million. So that's one alderman with one idea, $10 million. Extrapolate that across 50 aldermen, you could have $500 million in savings if everybody comes up with just one idea to save money. And I'm glad that we're doing it this way, because we should all be very involved in this process. It's about bringing new ideas and new thinking to the table.
And what about the state's budget issues? Is that something that's not only affecting the city, but also affecting your ward, in your opinion?
It's affecting the quality of life throughout the state of Illinois. We have to get our own house in order here in the city council, and I don't want to be the one to point a finger at Springfield all the time, but I worked in Springfield for a period of time. I worked on the Appropriations Committee as a staff person, and I've never seen the type of gridlock that we're experiencing right now. It's very distressing, and we'll all suffer for it. There's a very important social safety net that is largely the function of state government, more so than city government, and as that starts to fray, we're seeing more and more Chicagoans with nowhere to turn. We're talking in the field of healthcare and in mental health, social services. These things are very real, and they impact human lives, and it's very distressing to see them being turned into political pawns in a game of brinkmanship in Springfield. So we've got to come to a resolution, and it needs to be sooner rather than later.
And it seems like that's some of the worry, of Chicagoans, maybe folks in your ward too, is that they're thinking of how the state's going to affect them, and they've seen it before, with some of the services that are being cut. But on top of that, like with the city's budget, are they looking at a property tax increase? Are they looking at things along that nature where it's going to be taking money out of their wallet?
Yeah, there's no question that we're going to be looking at some revenue proposals. Property taxes will be there. Sales tax increase is another thing that I've heard about. You'd mentioned casinos. There's also expansion of video gaming within the city. All sorts of ideas that could potentially generate new revenue. The key to evaluating any new revenue proposal, though, is does it live up to its promise? And sometimes it doesn't. That's one of the reasons I'm against the financial transaction tax that some of my colleagues are supporting. I believe if you were to impose a tax like that on the financial industry, that they would relocate, they'll move, and they'll take their revenue with them. So on paper, it looks like it'd be a revenue increase, but once you implement it, it turns out to be a revenue decrease. And you have to be very careful to not fall into a trap like that. Some of the other revenue ideas that I've heard, I think, would be more palpable, and we're going to be talking about those during the budget hearings coming up.
Now let's talk about some developments in your ward. One thing, economic development. The John Hancock Center has been in the news, it seems, of late. I know that there's developments. People are looking at, taking care of redoing the front plaza, maybe making the building a historic landmark. What are you hearing?
Well, I've met with the Landmarks Commission and the folks in city government that vet landmark proposals. I told them to begin the process of analyzing the Hancock for its suitability as a landmark. My personal belief is it should be a landmark. There's some question about whether it's old enough, how old is old enough to be a landmark, but we're going through this process right now with Marina Towers, a similarly aged building, just a little bit older than the Hancock building. So I think there's a precedent there. By the standards of people who look at photographs of the city of Chicago and look for iconic structures, clearly the Hancock is an icon. It is a historic structure, and I think it deserves the landmark status.
Another development that you're looking at is the S-curve on Lakeshore Drive. I know that that's been a subject for a sore subject for some commuters who may be getting in accidents. It can slow down traffic. What are you proposing?
Yes, well, this is an opportunity to revitalize Lakeshore Drive. As it stands right now, most of the bridge structures on Lakeshore Drive are beyond their useful service life. They're deteriorated. The Chicago winters are hard on bridges to begin with, but when you put those bridges right on the lakefront, it's extremely hard. The weather conditions have aged these structures to the point where many of them are getting to be almost unsafe. You see chunks of concrete spalling and falling off of them. So the bridges have to be redone anyway. As long as we're doing that, we need to re-engineer Lakeshore Drive in its entirety. And the S-curve near Oak Street Beach and near the Drake Hotel is a traffic hazard. It's something that would never be allowed to be built today by modern traffic design standards. The engineers would tell you, you can't put a curve like this in a major arterial highway. It's unsafe. Multiple accidents typically happen there on a daily basis. So in order to straighten it out, we would have to actually create landfill in Lake Michigan, similar to what's being done now around Fullerton. We've calculated that you could add 64 acres of new land between Navy Pier and North Avenue that would allow you to both straighten out the S-curve and create park space where none exists. Now there's a concrete expanse there south of North Avenue Beach where there isn't any green space, and that's one of the most heavily used areas of the lakefront. So to have the opportunity to create parkland where none exists and to remove a known traffic hazard, it really is a win-win scenario, and we're in the process of looking for funding to bring this dream about into reality.
What about on the economic development front? And anything that that your office is seeing or working on right now?
Well, as the economy continues to recover, that's certainly a good thing for the city of Chicago. Our population in Chicago is growing now slowly after years of declines. And also jobs are relocating to Chicago. We're seeing a trend now of corporate relocations from the suburbs to the central area in Chicago, a reversal of what had been happening for years. So this is very exciting to me. This is something that I think is a good signal that we're on the cusp of great economic development. Now we have to control that economic development, we have to make sure it's appropriate, and we have to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support it. I view that as a primary part of my role as an alderman. Developers will always have ideas, and they'll always come to city government with ideas. We have to vet those ideas, allow for community input, and decide what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. But we're seeing a lot of these new proposals that are starting up again as a result of the economic recovery, and overall that's a good thing for the city.
And you talked about community input. I know that participatory budgeting is something that some wards do, that some aldermen do. Is this something that possibly you're looking into, possibly for your ward?
I am considering that. In fact, I've talked to Alderman Joe Moore, who is engaged in participatory budgeting for a number of years now, and has done a very good job of that. It wasn't something we could do in year one. We had, frankly, very little time to go ahead and allocate the menu money for the city to decide what road projects needed to be done. And to do participatory budgeting right, it's a time-consuming process, and we didn't have time for that this year, but that is something we're going to look at in the future and consider.
And for folks who may not know what that is, so talk to us about, well, what exactly does it mean when you're talking about participatory budgeting for the ward?
Each alderman each year gets an allocation of public funds called menu money. Typically, it's a little over $1 million this year. I think it was $1.3 million. And the alderman has the discretion to allocate that money as he or she sees fit on various capital projects, roads, streets, sidewalks, sewers, that sort of thing. Participatory budgeting brings the community into making those decisions, because that $1.3 million doesn't really go far enough. You know, there's infinite demand and limited resources. So each year you're faced with the unenviable task of having to decide which of the projects on the list are not going to get funded this year and which are. And the list of projects that are very worthy and wind up not getting funding is always much longer than the list of projects that you're able to fund. So participatory budgeting brings the community into that decision-making process, and it helps people to understand why you know, Project A is going to start this year and Project B is going to have to wait, and Project C might not happen for 3 more years. Those are all very complicated decisions that can't be made in a vacuum, and participatory budgeting allows all the voices in the neighborhood to have a say.
In fact, let's show your information again for people to contact you. Your office is at 1400 North Ashland Avenue. Phone number 312-643-2299. Your email at ward02@cityofchicago.org. So another thing like that has been in the news lately as well is the privatizing of garbage collection in terms of multi-use of apartments. Is this something, you know, that could be considered a revenue generator or a cost-cutting measure for the city?
Well, it could be considered both. I would argue that approaching it from a cost-cutting measure, which has been what we're doing lately, is a mistake. You know, it's a municipal service. We have to provide it. Can you imagine, you know, what the city would look like if we didn't pick up the garbage? You know, New York City provides an example of that, where, you know, they've had frequent strikes and labor slowdowns where the trash doesn't get picked up and it piles up on the streets. You know, it's a public safety issue. The trash should be picked up regularly and effectively, and we as a government are responsible for doing that. Recently, we've reduced the size of buildings that qualify for free residential trash pickup. I objected to that. I called it fundamentally unfair, which it is. If you look at the number of people in my ward that get free city pickup, it's probably about 10% of the residential addresses. Some wards it's as high as 90%. So I don't think it's fair, and we have to make some changes, because trash pickup isn't something that we should be seeking to make a profit on. It's something we should be doing because it's a very important part of the quality of life in the city neighborhoods.
Well, it looks like we just have to wrap up the show. About a minute left. In closing, what would you like, you know, to say, you know, like how your experience has been and what you look forward to, you know, in the near future?
Well, yes, I would like to thank the voters of the Second Ward for giving me this opportunity. It's been a tremendous experience. The first 3 months on the job have been an exciting whirlwind, and it's a privilege. I wake up every day honored to have this challenge and honored to have the privilege of serving. I'm very fortunate to have an outstanding staff. One of the best decisions that I made early on was to hire the staff that I have. Every one of them is committed, dedicated, hardworking, and they're doing a great job, and they make us all look good. So that's part of the reason that I'm enjoying this new role as alderman, is because I've got such a good team behind me, and I feel very optimistic that we're going to get done the things that we said we were going to get done, and the neighborhood's going to be a better place after we're done working on our projects.
I'm going to show your information just one more time for people in terms of how they can get a hold of you, with your office at 1400 North Ashland Avenue and your phone number 312-643-2299. All right, Alderman Hopkins, thank you again for coming on the show this evening.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed it.
All right, and that's our show for tonight. You guys now have a good night. Bye-bye.